Thanks for joining us today. We have a great topic for you all, a holistic framework for conducting ethical field research. It's relevant for anyone who does field-based or human-centric data collection and really wants to understand how they can take a more ethical approach in doing so. Before we get into it, I do want to start by providing some context for how this presentation came about and why we chose this topic. So for starters, you might have noticed in the webinar invites or even on this slide that TUM is partnering with SurveyCTO for this webinar. And as a preface, SurveyCTO is a data collection platform used for, quantitative and qualitative research and survey creation. And our focus is really to support primary data collection. And because we see that a lot of our users are in academia, every year we have a grant program for PhD students where those conducting data collection for their research are invited to apply. And our winners are those whose projects use interesting data collection methodology, work in novel research fields, and whose work we believe will really have an impact on social, economic policies. And Ines was one such grant winner. Her research project is titled Unveiling Dynamics of Control, Understanding Economic Violence and Reproductive Coercion in Intimate Partner Violence. And in order for her to understand how prevalent economics and reproductive coercion are and how they're linked, she needed to conduct, thousands of in-depth interviews with husbands and wives and these really sensitive topics, right? And not only that, she was conducting this research across 3 states in India where there are certain cultural and gender norms that can impact how enumerators, how data collectors would logistically implement this data collection. So in talking with Ines and Rucha, it became clear that there are a lot of important things to consider when conducting this type of research. And it was also clear that there are a lot of learnings to share. And that's what we want to center today's discussion around. It's really with the goal of helping you all keep these important things in mind as you conduct your own research. And so before we get started into the webinar itself, I will give a more formal speaker introduction before we move on. So firstly, we have Ines Boehret. She is a PhD candidate in global health in the Department of Governance in the School of Social Sciences and Technology at TUM. Her experience is really centered in gender-based violence, reproductive health and rights, and humanitarian relief. And she is committed to using her evidence-based research to really influence social change in those areas. We also have Rucha Vasumati Satish, an independent researcher, as well as project manager at Sambodhi, who is the partner organization that Ines worked with to actually collect the field data. Rucha is focused on connecting the gap between research and reality with extensive experience in really translating research design into actual field implementation. And lastly, my name is Shirley Sweeney. I'm the marketing director at SurveyCTO, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, here's our agenda. And so we'll begin with kind of like an overview defining the importance of ethical research, and then get into the 3 focus areas of how you can conduct ethical research. And we'll end with a workshop around how you can kind of internalize these learnings, and then also end with some Q&A. So with that, I will hand it off to Ines to start.
Thank you so much, Shirley, for the introduction. And hi, everybody. It's really nice to have you here today. Let's start right away with a brief definition of ethical research, so we are all on the same page and know what we mean when we talk about ethical research in the field. So ethical research aims to safeguard the rights, the dignity, and the well-being of participants, communities, and also enumerators, while at the same time upholding scientific rigor. And there is a number of frameworks of guidelines that help us to do so. One very important guideline is the Belmont Report from 1979 that applies to any kind of research that involves human subjects. And then there are also more context-specific guidelines. For example, the Declaration of Helsinki that really looks into research around healthcare topics. There are WHO guidelines that specifically focus on research around violence against women. So it's really important to look into your specific field and see what kind of guidelines and frameworks there are that might apply to your studies and research. Even though there are a number of frameworks and guidelines, there are some core aspects that you will find in any of those guidelines. One is informed consent and confidentiality, where we really need to make sure that participants are well informed. They know why we collect their data, how we will collect it, how it's going to be stored, and how it's going to be used. And this is not a one-time thing where we just ask people to sign some kind of document, but it's an ongoing process. And I think Rucha will talk a bit more about that in a bit. Then we have the risk-benefit balance, where we always need to make sure that the benefits really outweigh the risks that might also be part of our research, right? And we have justice, where we need to make sure that we also reflect on our own researchers' positionality and our own biases we might bring to the table. And we need to reflect on the share of those risks and benefits. And we can never really do research just for the sake of research, just for the sake of scientific interest. But we always need to make sure that there is a benefit at the end of the day, and that this benefit will also be shared with the participants who maybe shared the burden of the research. So let's have a quick look at why ethical research is important and necessary in the first place. And I think there are like three distinct layers that are important here to mention. The first one would be the ethical imperative, which is like the moral basis that asks us to do no harm, and that really aims to safeguard the dignity and the safety of both, again, respondents and enumerators. We also have institutional requirements. So before we start any kind of research, we need to make sure that we got ethics approval. Usually you would need that from both your home institution and an institutional review board in the country where you are planning to conduct your research. And this can be a quite time-consuming process, and often there are lots of forms you have to fill out, but it can also be a very helpful process that asks you and helps you to really reflect on details that you might have not been aware of before, right? And any kind of risks that you were not foreseeing, but that you need to mitigate before you start your research. And then there are the legal requirements, which ask us to comply with data protection regulations, for example, to ensure that we handle the data in a legal and responsible way. And none of these components of ethical research guarantees ethical research on its own. I think it's really about their interplay and how they are combined and support each other. And we always need to be aware of all three of these components. Okay, with that, I will hand over to my colleague Rucha.
Thank you so much, Ines, and hello everyone. Thank you for all you joining today's webinar. So yes, so I think we can start off the protecting the respondent. So why the protecting the respondent is very important? Because when we conduct the research involving the people, especially on sensitive topic, our first responsibility is not only the collecting data, but to protect the people who place their trust in us. So every participant is giving us their time, sharing their experiences, and often discussing very personal aspects of their lives. So as a researcher, we have an ethical responsibility to ensure that they feel safe, respected, and comfortable throughout the entire research process. So that's why the protecting the respondent is very fundamental, because research should never cause harm. So a participant, a participant's dignity, right, privacy, and well-being must always come before the research itself, I think. So if participants do not feel safe or respected, that may experiences distress, choose not to participate, or feel pressurized to answer the questions. So affect their own life. So that's why our responsibility as a researcher to create an environment where participant is truly voluntarily, and where the participant feel empowered to make their own decisions. That's why when we talk about the protect the respondent, we have the if we want to do into this practice, we do this by following the 5 key consideration throughout the stage of the data collection or an interview. So first is about the informed consent. So maybe you already know about it, but what is the informed consent? So informed consent is means that participant understand the purpose of the study and what participation involves and any potential risk or benefits, and that taking a part is completely voluntary. Also have the right to refuse to participate or skip any question or stop an interview at any time without any negative consequences. If the some participant cannot read or have a limited literacy, that time the consent form should not simply be handed to them. Instead of that, enumerator, it means who is collecting the data, they have to read the consent information aloud, and the participant prefer to participant language and explain it the simple and clear terms. So, and also check the participant is understood the consent, all the information what we tell, what we inform to them. So it should not be only agree or disagree. We have to tell them briefly about what is our research and why we want to collect the data. I just want to give a briefly one small example about it. So in field studies in rural Maharashtra and India, one day the enumerator was hurry and asked the participant to sign the consent form without any properly explaining the study. And after the few survey question, the participant become suspicious and started asking the questions like, who are you and why are you asking this question and who sent you? And instead of answering the survey, the participant kept asking the question enumerator, and the interview took much longer than expected. So the experiences reminded us that informed consent is much more than the obtaining a signature. It's about to building a trust, ensuring that participant understanding the purpose of the study and what participation involves and their rights before the interview begins. So when participants are well informed, and then they are more comfortable and interview runs more smoothly. So that's why the informed consent is very I think it's very important aspect when we talk about the protect the respondent. The second is about dignity. So we already know about the dignity means the treating every participant with a respect regardless of their age, gender, caste, class, or like any religious background. And it also means that recognizing that every participant has to the right to make their own decision about whether they whether and how they participate in the study. So, as a researcher, we should use the respectful language, be sensitive to local and local customs or traditional values, avoid making assumptions or judgments, or never pressure to participant to answer questions if they are uncomfortable with it. So, participants should always feel and that they are control of their participation. So I also want to give a small quick example for that. So in my one of my monitoring visit, during an interview, the participant give the answers related the religious belief or like superstitions related some answer, and like local tradition some practice, and the enumerator smiled and said, oh, you still believe that. And although the comment was not intended to offend, but it made the participant feel very judged. And after that, the participant become very hesitant and stop sharing the genuine opinion. And like the participant started to giving answer that she thought the enumerated wanted to hear. So the experiences reminded us that as a researcher, we should never judge or comment on participant belief, customs, or any personal values, even if they are different for our own. Our role is just listen respectfully, not to agree and disagree. So when we respect the participant cultural norms and their own value, they can answer us more freely. So another important practice to learn about the community cultural norm and tradition and local customs before visiting the clusters where we collecting the data. So because it's understanding the local context and help the researcher to build their sensitivity more. So this is the very important aspect about the dignity. And the third one is the privacy. So privacy is means that conducting the interview where no one else can overhear the conversation, or ensuring that participant response remain confidential. Because the thing is that the many research studies include the questions about the personal experiences, family relationship, finances, or health or reproductive health related question. And without privacy, participant may not feel to comfortable the answering honestly. So it's some situation being like overheard could even place them at the risk. Another example I want to just present in the field during the interview, like one interview, a participant shared that she had experiences discrimination in her community. While interviewing another participant later that day, the enumerator said, oh, the last interview, the women I interviewed told the same thing. Like the last interview also, I heard the same thing. So sharing this information for one interview to another interview was like we just break the confidentiality. So that's why the privacy is very important. And because of that situation, the second participant immediately became very uncomfortable and wonder, oh, whether her own responser would also be shared with others. So that's why privacy is very key aspect for the protect the respondent. And also as a researcher, keep the every participant information confidential, ensure that their identity and response are never disclosed. I think it's very core value for a researcher. Then we have the next the consideration, the accessibility. So accessibility, it means that making sure that every participant can understand the interview and participate the comfortably, regardless their literacy level, language, disability, or familiarity with technology. Because as an enumerator, when they are going, they train for the SurveyCTO. They know about to the time, and they also have sometimes the pressure of like that they have to complete this day like 5 interviews or 6 interviews. That's why sometimes they are not thinking about participant accessibility. So it's very important, because if participant does not understand the question, they cannot provide the meaningful answers. So making the interview accessible to ensures that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate, and that the information we collect the accurate. So want to give one small example about it. For example, if someone doesn't understand the question, don't simply repeat in the same word. Maybe we can use their own local language, or maybe we can help to another enumerator if they are present, or we can ask them, did you understand correctly? Something like that. But we just don't have to assume everything, okay, they have to understand. So accessibility is very important thing. And then we have a safe and private environment. So safe and private environment is a one where the participant feel comfortable and speaking freely without fear or being overheard, interrupt, judge, or influenced by other. So why it's important? Because when participants feel safe, they are more likely to share honest information. If they don't feel safe, they may withhold information, change their answers, or become stressed. So the example, like last field work when I went, that time the respondent was answering comfortably. After a few minutes, two neighbors came and sat down and saying that they just wanted to listen. So the participant body language is immediately changed, and like the participant became very quiet and started giving very short answers. So a participant may not always tell you they feel unsafe, but their body language often will tell us. So as an enumerator or as a researcher, we need to recognize those signs and always prioritize that participant safety over the completing the interviews. So I think the overall this protect the respondent, when we think about it, it's just not like a one action. It is something that we have to do the throughout the interview process, the before the interview process also, and after the interview process, and the throughout the interview process also. Because if we protect the participant by ensuring they understand the study before agreeing to participate, treating them to the dignity and respect, protecting the privacy, making the interview accessible to everyone, and creating the safe environment where they can speak freely. So at the end of the day, our success, I think, not measure like how many interview we completed, but it's also that how much the data quality, how much we collected. So this is the, I think, the main aspect for the protect the respondent. So like now we already discussed about some key consideration about the protect the respondent. But now I want to share some practical strategies we use in the field to protect respondent. So first one is the use Akasi. So the first strategy is the using Akasi. We can say the Akasi is the audio computer assisted self-interviewing. A feature is supported by SurveyCTO. It's very useful for the sensitive and personal questions. With Akasi, participant like wear the headphones and listen the pre-recorded questions and in their preferred language, of course, and on a tablet or a phone, and they can read the questions. Of course, they can also read the questions on the screen if they are able to. And instead of the answering the interviewer, the participant enter their own response directly in the device themselves. So how does it work? So enumerator introduce the Akasi section and explain how to use the device, and the participant then wear the headphones, and then each question is played in the participant language, and the participant listen the question and they select the answers in the screen. And that time enumerator have to step back and does not see the participant response. This is very important thing. Sometimes it's also happen participant wear the headphones and enumerator is just sitting the besides and just looking at the if she is answering the correctly or not, and they also interrupt, no, this is wrong because you said the earlier question, it's happened, and you select here, it's wrong. So this is not the job of the enumerator. When they use Akasi, it's totally then it's a participants their hands that whatever they want to select answer, whatever they heard, they can choose their own answers. So this is the thing. And why the researcher is use the Akasi? Because it provide the greater privacy and confidentiality. It encourage the honest responses to the sensitive questions. And it's also, I think, very helpful for the limited literacy people, because the questions, sometimes it's very easy to listen the questions and answering their own. Overall, basically, Akasi helps to protect the respondents while improving the quality and the reliability of the data collected on sensitive topics. So, for example, in EcoWeek project, basically we asked the question related economic violence and other sensitive experiences. Many participants may feel uncomfortable answering this question directly to the interviewer. So in situation, Akasi is very helpful because it allows to participant to listen the questions privately throughout the headphone, and they can answer themselves. So that's why the Akasi is the best practice. And then second is the enumerator is pairs. So we always send the enumerators in pairs. This is important for the both the safety of the field team and also the protect the participant, because whenever the possible, the female participant should be interviewed by female enumerators and female participant, and male participant should be interviewed by male enumerators. This help to participant feel more comfortable, particularly when discussing on sensitive topics, or encourages more open and honest response. So and working in a pair, it also provide the support in a field, because for example, if one enumerator is conducting the interview, in that household too many members are present, so that time the another enumerator can engage that family members in some conversation, so the first enumerator can take the interview in peacefully. So this is the thing. And the third one is the create a safe space. So finally, we focus on the creating safe space before and during the interview is very important. This means make sure that participants feel comfortable, respected, able to speak freely, and we pay attention not only the physical environment but also to our own behavior, to our tone of voice, body language, and the way we respond to the participants. So we always use the PIES module approach. It's a reminders like a physical safety, emotional safety, intellectual safety, and social safety. It's very important for this aspect. So yes, so I think these all practices may seem very simple, but together they help to create the environment where the participant feels safe, respected, and confident to share their experiences. Thank you. I think I will hand over to Ines.
Thank you, Rucha. Okay, so let's now have a look at a second group of people that is always involved in any kind of research, right? But that is often overlooked when we talk about research ethics. And this is the group of enumerators. We know from the literature and also from our own experience that enumerators often face high pressure conditions, especially when they work on sensitive topics such as violence against women. They might be faced with very sensitive stories, and they might be faced with secondary trauma or re-traumatization. So they can experience a high emotional and workload burden. Rucha already mentioned unrealistic daily targets that might add to that kind of burden. And at the same time, we often see, particularly in international research, that there are power gaps between or within the research teams, right? So given those conditions, it might be really difficult for enumerators to actually raise their concerns and to also flag ethical issues they might experience in the field. And here we see that protecting the enumerator is really interlinked to protecting the respondent. Because if we do have an enumerator who's burnt out, who is not supported, who is not able to raise their concerns, this also then puts at risk their ethical standards when they are collecting data in the field and when they are interacting with the respondents. So what we did in our project to mitigate some of these risks, we looked at three interconnected components. The first and most important one was the mental health of enumerators. And here we directly integrated a trauma-informed training module in our enumerator training. So during our enumerator training, we did not only talk about the survey and how to ask each of the questions and how to prompt for better responses, but we also had a module where we talked specifically about the stress some of the enumerators might face and about the risk of secondary trauma or re-traumatization. And we provided the enumerators with practical tools that they can use to reduce the stress, but also with access to counseling sessions that they could request at any time in an anonymous way and that were paid for through the project budget. The second component were well-programmed survey instruments. So what we mean by that was just to have like a really clear skip logic to make sure that you also prompt for breaks within the survey, that you add visuals, for example, to prevent interview fatigue, which would also then reduce the burden on the enumerators. And the third aspect here is peer support. And what we did here was we created WhatsApp groups to connect not only the enumerator pairs that went out together, but also connect them to their peers that they connected with during their training. So they could support each other, they could keep each other updated. We checked in on a regular basis with them. And we also had community catalysts in each of the villages where the data was collected who supported the enumerators in those villages by having access to participants or dealing with logistical aspects, for example. And then the last aspect that we wanted to touch on is the protection of the data. And here we often talk about navigating regulations. And the most important part here is confidentiality. Rucha already talked about confidentiality during the interview process, but we also need to make sure that the interview and the data stays private after collection. And we must account for data storage, for its retention, and the anonymization processes. There are many different guidelines and regulations that you need to adhere to. In Germany, it would be the Federal Data Protection Act and GDPR. And those regulations, for example, set bars on encryption and access controls. So, for example, here we need to make sure that no unauthorized person has access to our data and that when the data travels from the tablet to the server, for example, it is encrypted. We have rules around data minimization and data integrity. So what that means is that we really need to make sure that we only collect the data that we are going to use in the end, right? And I understand that it can be really tempting to add a couple of questions here and there if you have access to a big pool of respondents. But if you don't really know how you are going to use the data that you are getting with these questions, if you are going to write a paper based on that, if you have an analysis plan already, then you should not add those questions because they are just adding to the burden that enumerators and respondents face already. And then, of course, there are many regulations around anonymization and pseudonymization. And here you need to pick the right approach also based on your study design. If possible, anonymization is always the preferred way. But for example, in our case, we are running a randomized controlled trial. So there is a baseline data collection that took place last year, and we are now just about to start endline data collection. And we need to be able to link the respondents' data from baseline to endline, right? So we need to pseudonymize our data for now. And here are a couple more best practices that can be helpful when it comes to protecting the data. The first one, as I said, is encryption, which prevents data breaches during data transit. And here, your platforms that you use, for example, SurveyCTO, usually has various encryption layers that you can enable. Access control is the second important aspect that limits data exposure to necessary stuff and prevents unauthorized response editing. And this can be achieved through settings the user roles and really defining who has access to do what. So with SurveyCTO, for example, we defined user roles for enumerators who were able to collect data, but not to edit data later. We had people who were allowed to monitor the data, but maybe only in an anonymized way. Then we have the question digital versus paper-based surveys, right? And it's sometimes a bit tricky because depending on your respondents, some people might prefer actually a paper-based survey, but this also comes with some backlashes, right? Some problems because there might be physical loss, there might be manual errors when you are transferring your data from a paper-based survey to a digital tool. So for us, the digital tool worked really well to address those issues. And we were running our surveys on tablets, but you can also run surveys on phones, for example. And then lastly, we've got the pseudonymization that I was just talking about already, which protects respondents' identity while at the same time keeping the data usable for analysis if you're planning a follow-up study with the same sample. And here we use SurveyCTO's unique case IDs, which were automatically created for each of the respondents. So this was a lot of input, I think, on many different topics. And what we were planning to do now was to look into some specific case scenarios and see how some of these aspects can be translated into real-world scenarios. And therefore, I hand over again to Rucha.
As Ines said that like we discuss all the ethical principle or like principles to protecting the respondents, protecting to enumerator, and also we discuss about the strategies and everything. But applying this all in field can sometimes is very challenging. So as a researcher, like we can maybe encounter like unexpected situation and we have to take the decision on that time very quickly. So that's why we are going to practice applying this principle in real life scenarios that you might be also faced during like your field work or your data collection time. The first scenario is like the no privacy for the interview. So for example, you arrive at the respondent house to interview a woman, and the house is very small and there is a no private place to talk, and her husband remains nearby throughout the conversation and can hear everything. So the question is about that, how would you handle this situation while the protecting the respondent's privacy, safety and comfort? I can share about it, what is exactly happened. So the thing is that the first thing that I would like to think about this situation, because of the participant safety is very priority for us. I think that if the husband is present throughout the interview and then participant may not feel very comfortable to speaking like honestly. So more importantly, if she shares something very personal or very sensitive, it could affect her relationship. Even we put her very risk after, because we are leaving after the interview and we put her in a very risk situation. So as a researcher, our responsibility is to protect the participant from like any potential harm caused by the any question. So I want to explain that time we can stop the interview, or we can politely explain that interview needs to be conducted the private space, and ask if there is another place where we could go and talk freely. And if they are not very comfortable about it, then I would not continue that interview. Instead, I would arrange another time to return and when the participant feels safe or alone in the house. But I think in that situation, we have to stop the interview immediately, because we see like only not that the earlier also I told about that each time the participant can't say that she feel unsafe, but we have to see that her body language, or like, okay, how she answers the questions. So it's very important that participant safety is always important to complete the questionnaire, rather than the completing the questionnaire. So this is the first scenario. So the scenario two, it's about the community, like hesitation after the sensitive interview. So like after the completing interview, a woman tells the other women in the village that some question is felt too personal, and as a result the other women become very hesitant and to refuse to participate survey. So the question is like that, how in that scenario, how would you respond to the participant concerns and maintain the trust within the community without pursuing anyone to participate? So anyone wants to share the like solution or what they think about it, maybe in chat also. I think we get one response. Give the respondent time to her or himself ask question about the project, making sure that respondent knows that he or she can stop the interview at any time or skip or withdraw answers. Yes, this is really great. In that situation, I think we have to first respect of the women's opinion, because never pressure to anyone to participate. If several women have a concern, I would suggest that having an open discussion with the like all women to explain the purpose of the study and inform the consent process again and confidentiality, and that participation is completely like voluntarily, we can tell them again. And I think we can also tell them about they can skip the questions if they feel the very personal. And the women who tell the other women, we can meet her and we can ask her if she think that she want to delete that data, we can also delete that data. So it's we can ensure her that it's okay. After the interview, you can also say that, oh, I don't want to participate, I just want to delete the data because of I don't feel very good. So if the community remains the hesitant or the situations become very tense, because it's happened in the EcoV project also in last time, that the all community members are very angry about the questions and everything. So I think it is also about it, the enumerator safety is also is very important aspect of this scenario, because we can inform that time the supervisor on the field, like, or the field coordinator, or we can take a support for the cluster coordinator or anyone. So this helps to protect participant and the enumerator also. And because the situation is become very tense, it will also very we are also putting in danger to enumerator. So we can also tell the enumerator that time you can leave that clusters after the all clarification, and you can leave you can stop the data collection on that day, like that. So we can also do that. So this is the, I think, what I thought about this. The third scenario is very we also feel this many times. We also experience this many times during the interview. You notice that the respondent is giving the same answer to many questions, and they seem very distracted and tired and hurry and not fully engaged the interview. So what do you think about to ensure the good quality data, and while the it means, what do you all think about it? Okay, we get a very nice response. So yes, so ask whether the respondent feels comfortable, tired, stressed, and tell that interview can be stopped without any problem. If the respondent does not feel good, and also offer to maybe come back to another time that suits the respondent better. Maybe there are certain times of the day which the respondents has too much burden and does not feel ready. Yes, I totally totally agree with this point. And yes, and I just want to add one thing that we can also have a short informal conversation between the interview. If we feel that participant is too tired about the same questions and everything, we can ask them about any other question. It is not related to questionnaire, like the informal conversation about the climate change, their own, if they are farmer, then we can ask about their farming activities or weather, about their village festivals or something like that. And then we can also rapport with them, and then we can ask that would you like to take a short break, or would you want to continue that interview, or any other time we can take that interview, something like that. So yes, so thank you so much all the respond to the scenario. And I think like all these scenarios, you also I'm sure that whenever we did the field work or data collection, we always face like some scenarios. And I think we always have to reminder that participant protection and the enumerator protection is very priority for our research. So yes, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Rucha, Ines. And we were thinking about some good takeaways for you all after this presentation. And of course, we'll send out the recording and slides afterwards. But in these slides, we also thought it'd be good to kind of put together a checklist of all the important points that Ines and Rucha talked about today. And so these are things that you can keep in mind as a sort of checklist while you are preparing and undergoing your own field research. And I would just like to reiterate the points that Ines and Rucha made today. They're kind of very important components of how you can go about conducting ethical field research. And I think these are the three key layers to that. Ines, Rucha, I don't know if you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with everyone.
I think the final thought is like we already actually discussed about the 2-3 things about like whenever we conduct the interview in through a SurveyCTO also, that we have a really good method is the Akasi. So we have to maybe use that for the because it's not always for the personal or sensitive questions. It's also maybe we think that the questions is very easy, but participant maybe feel it's not very easy. So it's very useful for that. And I think the overall in the research perspective, as I already shared, that the thing is that the protecting the respondents is very key value for as a researcher, because there are too many things we have to do in the field, like protecting respondents and understanding the clusters, cultural norms and traditional values and everything before to conduct the data collection. Understand that village is very important thing, I think, and then we can collect that data and we can maintain that quality of that data. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just to add to that, I think what can be really helpful and important is to map out who is involved in your research, and to really make sure that all your ethical considerations apply to each and every person. And today we talked a lot about protecting the respondent, protecting the enumerator, but you also need to protect yourself, right? If you work on sensitive topics, for example, you need to make sure that your student assistants are well protected if they work with really sensitive topics, if they are analyzing data around violence, for example. So I think keeping in mind who's involved in your study and making sure that your ethical values really apply to all of them would be one of the key messages I would like you to take away.